At 2:30 in the morning, most people would see Robert Martinez as just another invisible worker pushing a mop across the 47th floor of Megacorp International. A middle-aged man in a faded uniform, whose biggest concern should be getting home to his 12-year-old daughter. But as he paused outside the glass conference room, watching the company's CEO speak desperately into her laptop screen while a stern Korean voice grew colder by the minute, Robert's weathered hands tightened around something far more valuable than his cleaning supplies. Hidden beneath 8 years of night shifts and humble silence was a secret that could either destroy his quiet life forever or save a deal worth more money than his small town had ever seen. The 7 Korean words forming on his lips weren't just about business. They carried the weight of a promise made to a dying woman, a truth that would make the most powerful CEO in the building question everything she thought she knew. What happened next would prove that sometimes the person who holds all the cards isn't the one sitting at the boardroom table, and the phrase that saved everything wasn't what anyone expected to hear. The story begins 6 months earlier, in the quiet town of Oakwood, Massachusetts, where Robert Martinez had perfected the art of being invisible. Every night, at 11 o'clock sharp, he would badge into Megacorp International, slip on his cleaning gloves, and begin the methodical process of making the corporate world spotless for the executives who would arrive in 8 hours. His navy blue uniform bore the simple name tag R. Martinez, and in 8 years most people had never bothered to learn what the R stood for. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who once balanced million-dollar accounts now balanced buckets and brooms. But Robert had made peace with that trade long ago. At home in his modest 2-story house, 10 minutes from Megacorp, 12-year-old Emma Martinez was the center of Robert's universe. She had her mother's dark eyes and stubborn streak, along with a gift for languages that reminded Robert daily of the woman he'd lost 3 years ago. Emma spoke English with her friends, Spanish with her grandmother, and Korean with the memory of her mother, a beautiful woman named Sarah who had taught them both that some words carry more weight than others. The house still held traces of Sarah's presence: Korean cookbooks in the kitchen, Hangul characters taped to Emma's bedroom mirror, and a small shrine of photos where Robert would sometimes catch his daughter whispering prayers in a language that sounded like music. Robert's transformation from corporate accountant to night janitor hadn't been a fall from grace. It had been a deliberate choice. When Sarah's cancer diagnosis came with astronomical medical bills and a prognosis that demanded his constant presence, Robert had walked away from his 6-figure salary without looking back. The executive world that once consumed his days suddenly seemed trivial compared to holding his wife's hand through chemotherapy sessions and teaching Emma how to braid her hair when Sarah's fingers became too weak. After Sarah passed, Robert discovered that the corporate ladder he'd once climbed with such determination now felt like a prison of expectations and empty ambitions. The night shift at Megacorp offered something far more valuable than prestige: time with Emma and the peace that comes with honest work. Catherine Chen had been Megacorp's CEO for 3 years, and in that time she had transformed the mid-sized technology company from a regional player into a national contender. Her corner office on the 47th floor remained lit long after the executive parking lot emptied, and her reputation for working 18-hour days had become legendary throughout the building. What most people didn't know was that Catherine's relentless drive stemmed from a deep-seated fear of not being enough, a fear that had followed her from the orphanage in Seoul, where she'd spent the first 3 years of her life, to the adoption agency in Boston, where the Chen family had given her a new name and a new chance. She spoke perfect English, had mastered corporate finance, and could navigate boardroom politics with surgical precision. But late at night, when the building grew quiet, Catherine sometimes felt like that lost 3-year-old girl who couldn't remember the sound of her birth mother's voice. The first time Robert and Catherine spoke was in the elevator on a Tuesday night in December. She was heading up to her office with an armload of financial reports, and he was heading down to retrieve his cleaning cart from the basement storage room. The elevator lurched slightly between floors, and Catherine's papers scattered across the floor. Without thinking, Robert set down his mop bucket and helped gather the documents, his eyes automatically scanning the numbers as he handed them back. "The quarterly projections look optimistic," he said quietly, then immediately regretted breaking the unspoken rule that maintenance staff should remain invisible. Catherine looked at him with surprise, not because he had spoken, but because he had understood what he was looking at. "Thank you," she said, studying his face as if seeing him for the first time. "I'm Robert," he offered as the elevator doors opened. "Catherine," she replied, though they both knew she was Ms. Chen to everyone else in the building. After that night, their interactions became a quiet ritual that neither of them acknowledged directly. Catherine would arrive early for her late-night work sessions, and Robert would leave a fresh cup of coffee on the reception desk outside her office. Never too hot, always with one sugar packet and a splash of cream, exactly the way he'd noticed she'd prepared it in the break room. In return, Catherine began leaving small thank-you notes tucked under the coffee maker, eventually graduating to brief conversations about everything except their personal lives. She learned that Robert had an encyclopedic knowledge of financial markets and an uncanny ability to spot discrepancies in budget reports. He discovered that Catherine spoke fluent Mandarin, decent Japanese, and was struggling to learn Korean from a language app that frustrated her to tears most nights. "Why Korean?" Robert asked one evening as Catherine rubbed her temples after another failed attempt at pronunciation. "Business reasons," she replied, but something in her voice suggested the answer ran deeper than corporate strategy. Robert wanted to tell her that he could help, that Sarah had spent countless hours teaching him the subtle differences between formal and informal Korean speech, but some instinct held him back. Instead, he simply said, "Some languages can't be learned from apps. They have to be felt first." Catherine looked at him with that expression again, the one that suggested she was seeing something unexpected. "You sound like you know from experience," she said. Robert just smiled and returned to his work, leaving Catherine to wonder what other surprises the quiet janitor might be hiding. The truth was that Robert's understanding of Korean went far beyond casual conversation. Sarah had been born in Busan but raised in Seoul, and her family's textile business had required her to master the intricate nuances of formal Korean business language. During their 12-year marriage, she had insisted that Robert learn not just conversational Korean, but the specific phrases and cultural contexts that governed high-level business negotiations in Korea. "Someday," Sarah had told him with a laugh, "you might need to impress my father's business partners." That someday had never come for Sarah's family business, but the language had become their secret code, their private world where they could express emotions that somehow felt deeper in Korean than in English. As winter melted into spring, Robert and Catherine's late-night encounters evolved into something that resembled friendship, though neither would have used that word to describe their relationship. Catherine found herself looking forward to their brief conversations, and Robert discovered that he enjoyed having someone to talk to who appreciated both his financial insights and his ability to listen without judgment. They were two people who had built their lives around protecting themselves from vulnerability, yet somehow they had created a small space where their defenses could lower slightly. Catherine began sharing details about the mounting pressure she faced from Megacorp's board of directors, while Robert offered the kind of practical advice that only comes from years of experience in corporate finance. The turning point came on a humid Thursday night in May, when Catherine's phone buzzed with an urgent message that made her face go pale. Robert was polishing the conference table when he noticed her hands shaking as she read the text. "Bad news?" he asked gently. Catherine looked around the empty floor as if checking for hidden listeners, then said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Someone's been feeding information to the board. They think I'm hiding financial irregularity." Robert's cleaning cloth stopped moving across the table's surface. In his 8 years of working nights, he had learned that corporate buildings held secrets the way old houses held memories, and Megacorp was no exception. He had seen too many late-night meetings in conference rooms that were supposed to be empty, witnessed too many hushed phone calls between executives who thought they were alone. "What kind of irregularities?" Robert asked, his accountant instincts overriding his janitor discretion. Catherine hesitated, then pulled up a spreadsheet on her laptop. "The numbers don't add up in our Asian markets division, but I can't figure out where the discrepancy is coming from. Someone's either cooking the books or—" She trailed off, but Robert could see the fear in her eyes. He moved closer to the screen, his trained eyes scanning the columns of data with the speed and precision that had once made him one of Boston's most sought-after corporate accountants. Within minutes, he had identified 3 separate anomalies that suggested systematic manipulation rather than random errors. "This isn't about hiding irregularities," he said quietly. "This is about creating them to make you look incompetent." Catherine stared at Robert as if he had just revealed that he could fly. "How did you? Who are you really?" she asked. For a moment, Robert considered deflecting the question with humor, or changing the subject entirely, but something about the vulnerability in Catherine's voice made him decide on honesty. "I used to be the kind of person who solved problems like this for a living," he said. "Before I chose a different kind of life." Catherine's expression shifted from surprise to something that looked like relief mixed with curiosity. "Why did you choose differently?" she asked. Robert's hand instinctively moved to the gold wedding band he still wore on his left ring finger, a gesture that Catherine noticed, but didn't comment on. "Because I learned that some things matter more than being important," he said simply. That night marked the beginning of a partnership that neither of them fully understood. Catherine began staying later, ostensibly to work on quarterly reports, but increasingly to talk through business challenges with the janitor, who saw patterns that escaped Harvard MBAs. Robert found himself looking forward to these conversations in a way that surprised him, not just because he missed using his analytical skills, but because Catherine's sharp mind and dry sense of humor reminded him of what it felt like to connect with someone who understood the complex world he had once inhabited. They never discussed their growing friendship directly, but both began to rely on the stability of their late-night encounters in a way that felt dangerously close to emotional dependence. The crisis that would test everything began to unfold in early June, when Catherine received a call that could change Megacorp's future forever. Hansung Electronics, one of South Korea's largest technology conglomerates, was looking for an American partner to help expand their semiconductor manufacturing into the North American market. The potential deal was worth $180 million over 3 years, enough to secure Megacorp's position as a major player in the tech industry and silence the board members who had been questioning Catherine's leadership. There was just one catch. Hansung's CEO, Dr. Park Jae-woo, had a reputation for conducting business exclusively in Korean and for making decisions based as much on personal trust as financial projections. Catherine's excitement about the Hansung opportunity was tempered by a growing sense of dread about her limited Korean language skills. Her business Mandarin was flawless and her Japanese was serviceable, but Korean remained the language that defeated her despite months of dedicated study. "It's not just about vocabulary," she confided to Robert one night, as they reviewed Hansung's preliminary requirements. "Dr. Park comes from the old school of Korean business culture. If I can't demonstrate proper respect and understanding of hierarchy, the deal will die before it starts." Robert watched Catherine practice Korean phrases from her language app, her frustration evident as she struggled with pronunciations that seemed to shift depending on context. He wanted to help, but revealing the depth of his Korean fluency would require explanations he wasn't ready to give. As the hands-on negotiation progressed through the summer, Catherine's stress levels rose proportionally with the deal's potential value. The preliminary meetings went well, but Dr. Park remained reserved, occasionally switching to rapid Korean when discussing sensitive points with his own team. Catherine could follow perhaps 30% of these conversations, leaving her constantly worried that she was missing crucial information, or, worse, being deliberately excluded from decisions about her own company's future. Her insomnia worsened, and Robert began finding her in the office at increasingly odd hours, sometimes catching her asleep at her desk when he arrived for his 11 p.m. shift. The situation became more complicated when Richard Blackwood, chairman of Megacorp's board of directors, began scheduling his own meetings with the Hansung team. Blackwood was a silver-haired corporate veteran who had built his career on the philosophy that CEOs were expendable, but board relationships were forever. Robert had been cleaning conference rooms during several of Blackwood's conversations with other board members, and the content of those discussions would have alarmed Catherine if she had known about them. Blackwood was positioning himself as a more stable alternative to Catherine's leadership, subtly undermining her credibility, while positioning Megacorp for a leadership change that would coincide conveniently with the Hansung deal's completion. Emma Martinez had inherited her mother's intuitive understanding of people, and she could sense her father's growing tension even when he tried to hide it. "You're worried about someone at work," she observed one Saturday morning as they made pancakes together in their small kitchen. "Is it the lady who speaks Korean?" Robert paused in his stirring, surprised by his daughter's perceptiveness. He had mentioned Catherine only in passing, but Emma had clearly picked up on something in his tone. "She's dealing with some difficult people," Robert admitted. "Sometimes grown-ups can be mean to each other, especially when money is involved." Emma considered this seriously, then said, "Mom used to say that when someone needs help, you help them, even if it's scary. Especially if it's scary." The final phase of the Hansung negotiation was scheduled for the first week of September, with Dr. Park flying to Boston for 3 days of intensive meetings that would determine Megacorp's future. Catherine had prepared meticulously, hiring a Korean interpreter and studying cultural protocols with the dedication of a graduate student. What she didn't know was that Richard Blackwood had been conducting his own communications with Hansung's team, casting doubt on Catherine's leadership stability and suggesting that a change in Megacorp's executive structure might be beneficial for all parties involved. These communications weren't technically illegal, but they violated every principle of corporate loyalty and created a situation where Catherine was fighting for a deal while simultaneously being sabotaged by her own board. Robert discovered the extent of Blackwood's betrayal purely by accident on the Tuesday night before Dr. Park's arrival. He was cleaning the 43rd floor conference room when he noticed that someone had left a computer connected to the room's presentation system. The screen displayed an email thread between Blackwood and someone at Hansung, with subject lines that made Robert's stomach turn. "Concerns about current leadership," and "transition planning for post-deal structure." Robert knew he should disconnect the computer and leave, but his protective instincts toward Catherine overrode his professional boundaries. The emails painted a clear picture of Blackwood's plan to use the Hansung deal as leverage to force Catherine's resignation, positioning himself as the interim CEO who would provide the stability that Hansung supposedly preferred. The next morning, Robert called in sick to his day job, something he had never done in 8 years, and spent the afternoon researching everything he could find about Dr. Park Jin-woo and Hansung Electronics. His rusty Korean reading skills slowly returned as he navigated Korean business websites and news articles, piecing together a profile of a man who valued personal integrity above corporate politics. Dr. Park had built Hansung from a small family electronics company into a multinational corporation, but he had done so without sacrificing the Confucian principles that emphasize loyalty, respect, and honest dealing. If Dr. Park discovered that he was being used as a pawn in someone else's corporate coup, the reaction would be swift and final. That evening, Robert arrived at Megacorp earlier than usual, his mind racing with possible ways to warn Catherine without revealing how he had obtained his information. He found her in her office, surrounded by Korean phrase books and looking more exhausted than he had ever seen her. "The final meeting is tomorrow," she said without looking up. 3 years of work comes down to 8 hours in a conference room with a man who speaks a language I can barely understand." Robert sat down in a chair across from her desk, a violation of their unspoken protocol that made Catherine look up in surprise. "Catherine," he said, using her first name for only the second time since they had met. "There are things happening that you need to know about." For the next hour, Robert carefully explained what he had discovered about Blackwood's communications with Hansung, without revealing the specific circumstances of his discovery. Catherine's face went through a series of emotions: shock, anger, betrayal, and finally a steely determination that reminded Robert why she had become CEO in the first place. "That explains why Dr. Park's team has been asking questions about management stability," she said. "I thought it was standard due diligence, but Blackwood has been feeding them concerns about my leadership." Robert watched Catherine process this information, her analytical mind already working through possible responses and countermeasures. "What do I do?" she asked. "The meeting is in 18 hours, and now I know that half the people in the room are working against me." Robert took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change everything between them. You fight back, he said, and you do it in a way that Blackwood can't anticipate or counter. Catherine looked at him with the expression he had come to recognize, the one that suggested she was seeing something new in the quiet janitor who somehow understood corporate warfare better than most executives. "What do you mean?" she asked. Robert stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the lights of Oakwood spread below them. "Dr. Park values authenticity and personal integrity above everything else," he said. "Blackwood is counting on you to fail because of language barriers and cultural misunderstandings. But what if you could demonstrate a deeper understanding of Korean business culture than anyone expects?" The implication hung in the air between them like a challenge. Catherine stared at Robert's reflection in the window, suddenly understanding that this conversation was about more than business strategy. "How much Korean do you actually know?" she asked quietly. Robert turned around, and for the first time since his wife's death, he was about to share a piece of his heart with someone who might understand its value. "Enough," he said. "Enough to help you save this deal and expose Blackwood's manipulation at the same time." Catherine felt something shift in her chest, not just relief, but recognition of the kind of partnership she had never allowed herself to hope for. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked. Robert smiled, and Catherine realized she had never seen him look anything but serious before. "Because sometimes the right thing to do is also the thing that scares you most." The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp September clarity that makes everything seem possible. Catherine arrived at the office 2 hours early, her presentation materials organized and her strategy clear, but her nerves stretched taut with anticipation. Robert had gone home at his usual time, promising to return before the meeting began, and Catherine found herself counting on his presence in a way that would have terrified her a year ago. She had built her career on self-reliance and careful control, but the events of the past 24 hours had forced her to accept that some challenges required trust and partnership rather than solitary determination. Dr. Park Jin-woo arrived at Megacorp at exactly 9 o'clock, accompanied by 3 senior executives and an interpreter who looked like she had been briefed to expect communication difficulties. Robert, dressed in his most professional maintenance uniform, was replacing light bulbs in the conference room when the Hansung delegation toured the facility, and he observed Dr. Park with the careful attention of someone who understood the importance of first impressions. The Korean executive was a compact man in his early 60s, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, particularly the subtle signs of respect or disrespect in how he was greeted and treated by Megacorp's staff. The morning session proceeded exactly as Catherine had feared. Her presentation was flawless from a technical standpoint, but Dr. Park remained politely distant, occasionally speaking in rapid Korean to his team in ways that clearly excluded Catherine from important discussions. Richard Blackwood attended as an observer, ostensibly to demonstrate board support for the deal, but Catherine could feel his satisfaction every time Dr. Park looked skeptical or asked pointed questions about management continuity. By the lunch break, it was clear that the negotiation was trending toward failure, and Catherine excused herself to her office to regroup and consider her limited options. Robert found Catherine staring out her office window, her shoulders rigid with tension and disappointment. "It's not working," she said without turning around. "Every time I try to engage with Dr. Park directly, he retreats into Korean conversations that I can't follow. Blackwood is loving every minute of it." Robert moved to stand beside her at the window, close enough that Catherine could sense his presence without feeling crowded. "The afternoon session hasn't started yet," he said quietly, "and Dr. Park hasn't made his final decision. There's still time to change the dynamic." Catherine turned to look at him, and Robert saw both hope and fear in her expression. "What if it backfires?" she asked. "What if I make things worse?" Robert thought about Emma's words from the weekend. "When someone needs help, you help them, even if it's scary, and we'll deal with the consequences together," he said. The afternoon session began at 2 o'clock, with Dr. Park and his team seated on one side of the polished conference table, and Catherine, Blackwood, and 2 other Megacorp executives on the other. Robert was scheduled to clean the adjacent conference room during the meeting, positioning him within earshot but out of direct sight, an arrangement that seemed routine to everyone except Catherine, who knew that her unlikely ally was listening for the moment when his intervention might tip the balance. For the first hour, the discussion followed the same pattern as the morning session, with Dr. Park asking increasingly pointed questions about Megacorp's management structure and long-term stability. The crisis point came when Dr. Park received a text message that made his expression harden visibly. He excused himself for a brief consultation with his team, speaking in Korean that Catherine could barely follow, but which clearly concerned serious doubts about proceeding with the partnership. When Dr. Park returned to the main discussion, his tone had shifted from politely skeptical to coolly dismissive. "I'm afraid," he said in carefully measured English, "that Hansung has concerns about Megacorp's organizational stability that may not be compatible with a long-term partnership of this magnitude." Richard Blackwood leaned forward with an expression of false concern. "Dr. Park, if there are specific issues about leadership continuity that we should address," that was the moment Robert had been waiting for. Through the connecting door between conference rooms, he had heard Dr. Park's team discussing the anonymous communications they had received about Catherine's leadership, communications that painted her as inexperienced and potentially unreliable. He had also heard Dr. Park express frustration about conducting such an important negotiation through cultural and linguistic barriers that left too much room for misunderstanding. Robert set down his cleaning supplies, straightened his uniform shirt, and walked into the main conference room with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally decided to stop hiding. "Dr. Park," Robert said in flawless Korean, his pronunciation carrying the formal tones appropriate for addressing a senior executive, "I believe there has been a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of this partnership." The room fell silent with the kind of shocked quiet that follows an unexpected earthquake. Dr. Park's eyes widened, Catherine's hand froze halfway to her water glass, and Richard Blackwood's face went through several shades of confusion and alarm. Robert continued in Korean, his voice steady and respectful. "The communications you have received about Ms. Chen's leadership do not reflect the truth about her character or her company's stability. They reflect the ambitions of people who value power more than integrity." Dr. Park recovered from his surprise first, responding in Korean with a question about Robert's identity and his authority to speak on Megacorp's behalf. Robert's answer was simple and devastating. "I am someone who has worked in this building every night for 8 years, who has seen how Ms. Chen treats people when she thinks no one important is watching, and who learned your language from my Korean wife before she died. I am speaking not as a representative of this company, but as someone who recognizes authentic leadership when he sees it." The translation of this exchange, provided by Hansung's interpreter, sent a visible shockwave through the Megacorp side of the table, particularly when the interpreter emphasized the word wife, with a tone that conveyed deep respect for Robert's loss. Catherine felt her world shift on its axis as she watched Dr. Park lean forward with genuine interest for the first time all day. In careful English, supplemented by Korean phrases that Robert translated quietly, Dr. Park began asking questions about Robert's background and his assessment of Catherine's leadership style. Robert's answers were honest, detailed, and delivered with the kind of cultural sensitivity that can only come from deep familiarity with Korean business custom. He described Catherine's work ethic, her integrity in dealing with employees at every level, and her genuine commitment to building partnerships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. But Robert's most powerful moment came when Dr. Park asked directly about the leadership stability concerns that had been raised by anonymous sources. Robert looked across the table at Richard Blackwood, then addressed Dr. Park in a mixture of Korean and English that ensured everyone in the room understood his meaning. "The concerns you have heard about Ms. Chen's leadership come from people who mistake manipulation for wisdom and betrayal for strategy. In Korean business culture, you have a concept called jong, the deep emotional connections that make true partnerships possible. Ms. Chen understands jong in a way that some people in this room will never understand, because she leads with her heart as well as her mind." The silence that followed Robert's statement was broken by Dr. Park speaking directly to Catherine in English for the first time that day. "Miss Chen, this man speaks about you with great respect. In my experience, the true measure of a leader is not how they present themselves to important people, but how they treat people they believe have no power to help them. Your janitor clearly believes you are worthy of his loyalty and his risk. This tells me more about your character than any financial report." Catherine felt tears threaten as she realized that Robert had not only saved the deal, but had articulated something about her leadership that she had never been able to express herself. The remainder of the meeting proceeded with a warmth and directness that had been absent from all previous sessions. Dr. Park asked detailed questions about Megacorp's operations, but now his inquiries felt like due diligence from a potential partner, rather than skepticism from a doubtful observer. Robert remained in the room, serving as an informal cultural interpreter when complex concepts needed clarification, and Catherine watched in amazement as he navigated high-level business discussions with the fluency of someone who had been born to the corporate world. When Richard Blackwood attempted to reassert his authority by questioning Robert's appropriateness in the meeting, Dr. Park cut him off with a sharp look and a comment in Korean that Robert translated as, "Mr. Blackwood, authenticity cannot be scheduled or managed." The formal conclusion of the meeting came 3 hours later, when Dr. Park announced Hansung's commitment to the $180 million partnership, but with 2 conditions. Catherine would remain as CEO throughout the partnership period, and Robert Martinez would serve as the cultural liaison and financial oversight coordinator for all Korean aspects of the deal. Title came with a salary that was triple what Robert earned as a night janitor, along with the kind of respect and responsibility he had walked away from 8 years earlier. Catherine watched Robert's face as Dr. Park outlined the offer, seeing surprise, gratitude, and something that looked like fear, as he realized that accepting would mean leaving the invisible safety of his maintenance job. That evening, after the Hansung delegation had departed and the contracts were being drafted by teams of lawyers, Catherine and Robert found themselves alone in the conference room where everything had changed. "I don't know how to thank you," Catherine said, but Robert shook his head. "You don't need to thank me," he replied. "You needed help, and I was able to give it. That's what people do for each other." Catherine studied his face, seeing exhaustion and relief, but also a wariness that suggested he was already reconsidering his decision to emerge from the shadows. "The job offer from Dr. Park," she said carefully. "Are you going to accept it?" Robert was quiet for a long moment, his hands absently straightening papers that didn't need straightening. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been invisible for so long that I'm not sure I remember how to be seen." Catherine understood the fear behind Robert's hesitation better than he might have expected. Her own rise to CEO had required abandoning the safety of anonymity and accepting the vulnerability that comes with visibility and responsibility. "Being seen is terrifying," she said, "but being hidden is lonely. And after today, I don't think either of us can go back to pretending we don't know what we're capable of together." Robert looked at her with the expression she had come to cherish, the one that suggested he was seeing something in her that she couldn't see in herself. "Together?" he asked. Catherine felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with business partnerships, and everything to do with the recognition of someone who might understand the complicated architecture of her carefully constructed life. "If you're willing," she said simply. 6 months later, the transformation was complete, but subtle, in the way that real change often is. Robert had accepted Dr. Park's offer, but he had negotiated terms that allowed him to maintain his connection to the night shift world that had given him purpose during his darkest years. 3 nights a week, he still walked the halls of Megacorp after hours, not to clean, but to think, and to remember that authentic leadership could be found in any role if someone chose to embrace it fully. His new office was on the 45th floor, close enough to Catherine's that they could collaborate easily but separate enough to maintain their professional boundaries and individual identities. Emma Martinez had adjusted to her father's new visibility with the resilience that children often demonstrate when change brings opportunities rather than losses. She was now taking advanced Korean lessons from a tutor that Megacorp's expanded cultural program provided, and her weekend conversations with Dr. Park via video call had become a source of joy for both of them. Dr. Park had become something like an honorary grandfather to Emma, teaching her about Korean business culture and family traditions, with the patience of someone who understood that the next generation would inherit a more connected world than the one he had grown up in. The Hansung partnership had exceeded everyone's expectations. But its success was measured in more than financial returns. The cultural exchange program that Robert had developed brought Korean and American employees together for projects that built understanding along with profits. And Dr. Park often cited Megacorp as an example of how international business relationships could honor traditional values while embracing innovative approaches. Richard Blackwood had resigned from the board of directors 3 months after the Hansung deal was finalized, claiming he wanted to pursue other opportunities, but privately acknowledging that his credibility had been permanently damaged by his attempted manipulation of the partnership process. On a quiet Saturday morning in March, Catherine found herself in Robert's kitchen, teaching Emma how to make Korean pancakes while Robert prepared coffee with the same careful attention he had once brought to leaving cups on her office reception desk. The scene was domestic in a way that would have terrified Catherine a year earlier, but now felt like the most natural thing in the world. Emma chattered about her Korean lessons and her plans to visit Seoul with Dr. Park's family during summer vacation, while Catherine marveled at how seamlessly she had been woven into the fabric of a family she had never expected to find. "Dad," Emma said as she flipped a pancake with serious concentration, "do you miss being invisible?" Robert considered the question with the thoughtfulness that Catherine had learned to associate with his most honest answers. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Being invisible was safe, and safety can be addictive. But being seen by people who matter is better than being safe and alone." Catherine felt the truth of that statement settle into her chest like a warm weight. She had spent most of her adult life choosing safety over vulnerability, control over connection, and professional success over personal happiness. The events of the past year had forced her to reconsider those choices in ways that continued to surprise her. The gold wedding ring that Robert had worn for 11 years now sat in a place of honor on his bedroom dresser, next to a photograph of Sarah and Emma taken during happier times. He no longer wore the ring, but he hadn't discarded it either. Instead, it had become a bridge between his past and his present, a reminder that love could take different forms without diminishing the authenticity of any of them. Catherine understood the symbolism without it needing to be explained, just as Robert understood why she sometimes woke up in the middle of the night speaking Korean phrases she didn't remember learning. They were both people who had been shaped by loss and defined by their responses to circumstances beyond their control. The Korean phrase that had saved the deal, "Truth comes from the heart," had become a kind of motto for the new life they were building together, not just as business partners, but as people who had found in each other the kind of understanding that makes vulnerability feel like strength rather than weakness. Emma had calligraphy-dead the phrase in Hangul and framed it for Robert's new office, where it served as a daily reminder that the most important communications often happen in languages that transcend words and cultural boundaries. As spring arrived in Oakwood, Catherine and Robert had settled into a rhythm that honored both their professional responsibilities and their growing personal connection. They had not formally defined their relationship, partly because both of them had learned that the most meaningful bonds often resist easy categorization. What mattered was that they had found a way to be fully present in each other's lives, without losing the individual identities that had made their partnership possible in the first place. Emma served as both catalyst and witness to their evolving connection, her 12-year-old wisdom providing perspective that helped them navigate the transition from colleagues to something deeper and more lasting. The story of the janitor who saved a $180 million deal had become a legend within Megacorp and throughout the Boston business community. But Robert had learned to deflect attention from the dramatic moment to the longer process of building trust and demonstrating character that had made the moment possible. In interviews and speaking engagements, he emphasized that his intervention had been effective not because of linguistic fluency, but because it had revealed authentic relationships and values that Dr. Park could recognize and respect. The real victory had not been saving a business deal, but discovering that two people who had built their lives around self-protection could find ways to protect and support each other instead. On a warm evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch swing that Robert had installed in Catherine's backyard, watching Emma practice Korean conversation with Dr. Park via video call, Catherine reflected on how completely her life had changed direction in the span of less than a year. The woman who had once worked 18-hour days to avoid dealing with personal relationships now looked forward to family dinners and weekend conversations that had nothing to do with quarterly projections or market analysis. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't walked into that conference room?" she asked Robert. Robert considered the question seriously, as he did most of Catherine's inquiries about the pivotal moments that had brought them together. "I think about it sometimes," he said, "but then I remember something Sarah used to tell me. The universe has a way of putting people where they need to be, when they need to be there, if they're brave enough to recognize the moment and act on it." Catherine leaned against Robert's shoulder, feeling the solid comfort of someone who had chosen to risk everything for principles that mattered more than personal safety. "I'm glad you were brave enough," she said quietly. "I'm glad we both were." Emma's laughter drifted across the yard as Dr. Park told her a story in Korean about his own granddaughter. And Catherine marveled at how naturally her life had expanded to include this extended family of choice. The girl who had lost her mother too young was now surrounded by people who understood that love could be expressed in multiple languages and take forms that traditional definitions couldn't capture. Robert watched his daughter with the quiet satisfaction of a parent who had finally found the courage to build the kind of life that honored both his past and his future. The megacorp building still hummed with activity during the night shift, but now Robert's former colleagues in maintenance greeted him with a mixture of pride and amazement when he returned for his weekly walks through the floors he once cleaned. They had witnessed his transformation from invisible worker to respected executive, but more importantly, they had seen him maintain the same kindness and respect for their work that had characterized his 8 years among them. "You didn't forget where you came from," his replacement had told him one evening, and Robert had replied, "How could I? This place taught me that dignity comes from how you treat people, not from what title you hold." The photograph on Robert's new desk showed 3 faces: Emma grinning between Catherine and Dr. Park during their first official company dinner, all of them wearing traditional Korean hanbok that Dr. Park had brought as gifts from Seoul. It was an image that captured the multicultural, multi-generational family they had become, bound together not by blood or legal documents, but by shared values and mutual respect. Visitors to Robert's office often commented on the warmth evident in the photograph, and Robert would explain that it represented the kind of success that couldn't be measured in financial statements or quarterly reports. Catherine's own office had undergone subtle changes that reflected her expanded understanding of what leadership could look like. The wall behind her desk now displayed a series of calligraphy pieces that Emma had created, Korean phrases about wisdom, perseverance, and family, that served as daily reminders of the life she was building beyond the corporate world. Her work schedule, while still demanding, had been restructured to include time for the relationships that gave her work meaning and purpose. She had learned that true strength came not from independence, but from interdependence with people who shared her values and supported her growth. The success of the Hansung partnership had opened doors for other international collaborations, but Robert and Catherine approached each new opportunity with the lessons they had learned about the importance of cultural understanding and authentic communication. Their consulting work with other companies often focused less on financial projections and more on the human relationships that made sustainable business partnerships possible. They had become advocates for a model of corporate leadership that valued character as much as competence, and their example had inspired other executives to reconsider the relationship between personal integrity and professional success. Emma's bedroom wall was covered with maps of Korea and photographs from her video calls with Dr. Park's family, evidence of a connection that transcended geographic boundaries and generational differences. She had inherited her mother's gift for languages, but also her father's analytical mind and Catherine's determination, creating a unique combination of skills that promised to serve her well in an increasingly connected world. Her dream of becoming a cultural interpreter like her father had evolved into ambitions that included diplomacy, international business, and bridge building between communities that spoke different languages but shared common human experiences. The small shrine to Sarah's memory in the Martinez living room had been expanded to include photographs and mementos from their new life, creating a visual representation of how the past could be honored while making space for future growth. Catherine had contributed a Korean tea set that had belonged to her adoptive grandmother, and Emma had added drawings that depicted their extended family in both realistic and imaginative ways. The shrine had become a place where all three of them could reflect on the journey that had brought them together, and the gratitude they felt for the love that had made transformation possible. As summer approached, plans were underway for Emma's first trip to Korea, where she would spend 3 weeks with Dr. Park's family, while Robert and Catherine traveled together to Seoul for business meetings that would expand the Hansung partnership into new areas of technology development. The trip represented more than a business opportunity. It was a pilgrimage to the source of the language and culture that had brought them together, and a chance for Emma to connect with the heritage her mother had passed down to her through stories and lessons that had survived even death. The evening routine that had evolved in the Martinez household reflected the blending of Korean and American traditions that characterized their family life. Dinner conversations switched naturally between English and Korean. Homework sessions included both traditional math problems and Korean language practice, and bedtime stories drew from folk tales that Dr. Park had shared during their video call. Catherine had become fluent enough in Korean to help with Emma's language lessons, and she often found herself thinking in Korean phrases that captured emotions more precisely than their English equivalents. The gold wedding ring that had once symbolized Robert's connection to the past now rested beside a small Korean stone that Emma had given Catherine during a moment of particular closeness, when the 12-year-old had announced that Catherine was like a Korean mom, but different and special. The stone came from Dr. Park's garden in Seoul, and it represented the connections that could form across cultures and continents when people opened their hearts to possibilities they had never imagined. Catherine treasured the stone as much as she treasured the trust that had led Emma to offer it. The success story that had begun with 7 Korean words in a conference room had evolved into something larger and more meaningful than anyone could have predicted. Robert's intervention had saved a business deal, but the relationships that grew from that moment had saved 3 people from lives of isolation and missed opportunities. They had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of fear when something important was at stake. They had discovered that authenticity was not about being perfect, but about being honest enough to let others see both their strengths and their vulnerabilities. On the first anniversary of the day Robert had walked into the conference room and changed everything, Catherine organized a small celebration that included Dr. Park via video call and a Korean feast that Emma had helped prepare using recipes from her mother's cookbook. As they raised their glasses in a toast that combined English gratitude with Korean blessings, Robert reflected on the circular nature of their journey. He had begun as a man hiding from his past, evolved into someone willing to risk his present, and emerged as a person capable of building a future that honored all the parts of himself he had once thought incompatible. The phrase that had saved the deal, "Truth comes from the heart," continued to guide their decisions, both personal and professional. It reminded them that the most important communications happened not through technology or formal presentations, but through the willingness to be vulnerable and authentic with people who mattered. Emma had learned this lesson through watching her father find the courage to speak up for someone he cared about, and Catherine had learned it through accepting help from someone she had initially seen as beneath her notice. As they sat together on that anniversary evening, watching the sunset paint the sky above Oakwood in shades of gold and pink, Catherine realized that the story that had begun with a janitor and a CEO had evolved into something much more complex and beautiful. They were no longer just business partners or friends, but a family, created by choice and sustained by daily acts of love and respect. The Korean concept of jong, the deep emotional connection that makes true partnerships possible, had become the foundation of their shared life, proving that some bonds transcend cultural boundaries and conventional definitions. The journey from that first elevator conversation to this moment of quiet celebration had required each of them to abandon assumptions about themselves and others, to risk safety for growth, and to trust that authenticity would be rewarded rather than punished. They had learned that heroism was not about dramatic gestures in conference rooms, but about the daily choice to show up fully for the people who depended on them. The real victory was not saving a business deal, but creating a life where three people who had once felt invisible or alone could now see themselves clearly reflected in each other's eyes. Emma's voice, speaking Korean with increasing confidence as she thanked Dr. Park for his friendship and guidance, provided the perfect soundtrack for Robert and Catherine's private moment of gratitude. They had begun as strangers connected only by late-night encounters in an empty office building, but they had become something much more precious. A family bound together by shared values, mutual respect, and the courage to build something new from the pieces of their individual pasts. The phrase that had saved everything continued to echo in their daily lives, reminding them that the most important truths could only be spoken when they came from hearts that were open, honest, and brave enough to risk everything for love.